The hybrids came in waves, not metaphorically, literally, formations stacked behind formations, the rearmost ranks invisible against the starfield, their numbers blotting out the distant light of the system's outer planets. Thraxan Viltrumite fighters, each one carrying the core of what made Viltrumites the most dangerous species in the known galaxy, bred in numbers that the Empire in its original form had never been able to produce. Thragg had spent decades manufacturing this army in secret. He had spent decades waiting for exactly this moment. The moment was working as planned. Coalition ships burned in long, slow arcs across the engagement zone. Their drive systems destroyed, their hulls breached, their crews either dead or dying in the specific way that exposure to hard vacuum killed things. Without atmosphere to carry the sound, the destruction was entirely silent. Explosions bloomed and died without noise. Ships tore apart in perfect quiet. The frozen bodies of coalition alien soldiers spiraled away from the debris fields, mouths open in screams that reached nothing, spinning slowly into the dark. Mark saw all of it. He saw it between punches, which was the only way he was processing anything right now. A half-second of battlefield panorama during the recovery phase of each exchange, before the next hybrid filled his vision and demanded his complete attention. His suit was torn across the left shoulder. His lip was split, blood moving in a slow globe away from his face in the zero-gravity environment before his body's motion disturbed it. His left eye had been clipped by a strike 40 seconds ago and was running a quarter-second behind his right. He was winning his immediate engagements. He was winning them badly, taking 3 hits for every one he landed, grinding through opponents on durability and stubbornness rather than technique, surviving because Viltrumite physiology could absorb punishment that would kill anything else. He was winning each individual fight and losing the war. The hybrid in front of him now was female, dark-haired, with the broad build and the flat combat expression of something that had been trained from birth to do exactly this. She came in with a knee strike aimed at his midsection. He got his forearms down in time, took it on his arms instead of his stomach, felt the force travel up through his elbows and into his shoulders. His block had been half a second late. He was slowing. He countered with a right cross. She rolled with it, trained, disciplined, and came back with a palm strike to his sternum that broke his position open and left him temporarily without leverage. Somewhere to his left, Oliver was fighting 2 hybrids simultaneously, moving faster than Mark but absorbing damage at the same unsustainable rate. The sound of their impacts carried through the contact vibrations in Mark's suit, even without atmosphere to transmit it. Dull, massive concussions that registered in his bones rather than his ears. Somewhere further out, Nolan was a streak of motion through the engagement zone, visible only as a displacement, a line of destroyed hybrids tracing his path through the swarm. They were all losing. The hybrid hit him again. Across the jaw this time, a committed strike that snapped his head sideways and sent him tumbling a dozen meters through vacuum before he caught himself on his flight and stabilized. He raised his guard, set his feet. She was coming. He pulled his right arm back for the counter, and stopped. Complete, total, absolute cessation. His fist did not complete its arc. His body did not continue its defensive posture. He stopped with his weight half committed to a movement that did not finish, hovering in the engagement zone with his arms in a position that made no tactical sense, looking at something that was not the hybrid. She hit him, full force, no restraint, a right-hand strike directly to his unguarded face. His head snapped back. The impact registered across his entire skull. He did not move, did not respond, did not update his guard. She hit him again. Same hand, same target, the follow-up to the first. His head moved with the impact and returned to its original position. His eyes were open. They were focused on nothing. They were the eyes of a person who was not present in their own body, or of a person to whom something was happening that required every available unit of consciousness and had none left over for the physical world. The hybrid pulled back slightly. She looked at the thing in front of her, this half-breed who had been fighting her 10 seconds ago with desperate, furious competence, and did not know what she was seeing. Oliver screamed his name from 20 meters out. Alan the alien, monitoring from a command position 300 meters above the engagement zone, saw his feeds update with a new anomaly, Invincible, stationary, undefended, taking unanswered strikes. He diverted 6% of his attention from the tactical overview and watched. Nolan, tearing through hybrids at the engagement zone's northern edge, heard his son's name in Oliver's voice, and pivoted. Inside Mark's skull, 500 years arrived. Not as images, not as a film reel or a sequence of memories playing in order. It arrived as knowledge, the way fluency in a language arrives, the way the name of someone you know arrives when you see their face. Complete, integrated, already processed. He did not experience the individual memories. He simply, instantaneously, knew everything that followed from this moment. Every battle. He knew them. Every scar on his body that he hadn't received yet. Every name of every person he would watch die. The weight of centuries of command. The specific texture of what it felt like to rule an empire and lose pieces of yourself to it year by year. The techniques he would develop over 500 years of continuous warfare. The counters to those techniques and the counters to those counters. And beneath everything, beneath the weight of empire and the knowledge of centuries, this moment, this specific moment, this engagement zone, these burning ships, this desperate losing battle. He had carried this moment for 5 centuries the way you carry a scar. The moment he almost lost everything. The moment that would have been a catastrophe. The moment he now had the chance to make into something else, entirely. The hybrid hit him a third time. Mark's hand came up. It came up and it caught her fist. Not reactively. There was no reaction time involved. No last-instant reflex save. He simply raised his hand to the position where her fist was going to be, and closed his fingers around it before it arrived. The impact still registered. She was strong, genuinely strong, and he felt the force of her strike in his palm and up through his wrist. But his hand did not move. She pulled, her full strength committed, trying to retract her fist for the next strike. The fist did not move. He held it, without strain, without a visible demonstration of effort. He simply held it the way you'd hold a door open, the casual, incidental application of more than enough force for the task. She looked at her fist in his grip. She pulled again. Then she looked at his face. His eyes had refocused. They were on her now, present and clear and engaged. But they were not the eyes he had been fighting with 30 seconds ago. The desperate, slightly too wide eyes of a young man operating past his limits on instinct and stubbornness. These were different eyes. They were quiet in a way that eyes were not supposed to be quiet. They assessed her with a completeness and a dispassion that she could not find a frame for. Not anger, not contempt, not the competitive intensity of combat. Assessment. The way an expert looks at a problem they have solved before and are simply verifying the solution. He broke her wrist. One precise movement, not violent in the conventional sense, not a display of power. The movement of someone applying the correct amount of force to achieve a specific mechanical result. The wrist gave, and she pulled back and he let her go, because she was no longer the issue and had not been the issue for approximately 4 seconds. He looked past her. He looked at the battlefield with his new eyes, his old eyes, the ones that had seen 5 centuries of this, and had learned to read it the way a navigator reads a map. The hybrid swarm formation, and the 3 commanders directing it from specific positions in the mid-formation that young Mark would never have identified amid the chaos. The left flank of the coalition forces, and the reserve units that had not moved yet, that were waiting in the shadow of a debris field for the moment to converge. The communication pattern of the hybrid forces, the specific frequency interval of their coordination signals, which he knew because he had studied it for decades in the original timeline. He exhaled. Slowly. Once. The battle was loud in the way battles conducted through suit vibration and proximity impacts were loud. A continuous physical assault of force and compression and impact. Mark stood in the center of it and was, for the first time in this fight, completely still. He opened comments. His voice, when it came, was not the voice that had been coming through coalition channels for the past several hours. That voice had been urgent, reactive, occasionally desperate, the voice of a young fighter communicating in real time with limited information. The voice that came now was quiet. It was the voice of someone who was not hurrying because they had determined that hurrying was not required. "Hold your retreat," he said. "I need your eastern units to pull back 40 degrees and create a gap. Do it now." Allen's response was immediate. "Mark, what are you?" "Do it, Allen." A pause. 1 beat. "I won't ask twice." 3 seconds of silence on the channel. Then, the eastern units began to move. Oliver pulled up short 20 meters away. He had been flying toward his brother, preparing to run interference, preparing to do what you did when your brother stopped moving in the middle of a combat zone, and started taking undefended hits. He was ready to shield, to fight, to do whatever was needed. He stopped. He hovered. He looked at Mark. Mark was not looking at him. Mark was scanning the battlefield with the calm, comprehensive attention of someone reading a document they have read before. He was moving his head in small, deliberate increments, not searching, not trying to find something, confirming, verifying that what he knew was where he knew it to be. Oliver had grown up with this person. He knew every version of his brother that existed. The uncertain teenager, the developing hero, the exhausted fighter grinding through one crisis after another. He had fought alongside him. He had watched him bleed. He did not know the person he was looking at now. Something was different. Something fundamental. Below the surface, in the register of how Mark occupied space. Oliver could not have explained it if asked. He only knew that whatever had just happened to his brother was not nothing. He stayed where he was. He watched. Mark raised his hand to his comm. The next order was already forming. The order after that was already formed. He had 7 moves to make in the next 4 minutes, and he knew exactly what they were, and he knew exactly what they would produce. The battle had not changed. The hybrids were still swarming. The coalition ships were still burning. The numbers were still wrong. None of that was the same problem it had been 30 seconds ago. Eastern units, pull back 40 degrees. Create the gap. The Eastern Coalition battalions began their repositioning. 2,000 alien soldiers pulling back from a forward position that had cost them 600 casualties to hold, abandoning it in 40 seconds of controlled movement. From the outside, it looked like a mistake. It looked like a hole opening in the coalition line. An invitation, a weakness, exactly the kind of gap that a hybrid commander with formation training would recognize and exploit. 3 of Thragg's hybrid vanguard units saw it immediately and began redirecting their advance. Mark watched them redirect. He had known they would. Alan, the units you just moved, have them stop at the 40-degree position and hold. Do not advance further. Do not retreat further. They are a door, not a retreat. They're going to get hit from the front. The attack they're about to take from the rear, the one your sensors haven't detected yet because the units are inside a debris field on a passive drift trajectory. That attack is going to arrive in 90 seconds at the position they just vacated. Mark was already looking at the next problem. When it arrives at an empty position, those units will have to commit to a new approach. That commitment will take them out of the engagement for 4 minutes. Your eastern flank is clear for 4 minutes. Use it. Silence on the channel, long enough that Mark registered it. Then, from Alan, there are 42 Thraxan Viltrumite fighters on a passive drift behind that debris field. 47, Mark said. The outer 5 are running cold. No drive signatures. Your sensors missed them. Another silence. How do you know that? Because Thragg ran this exact formation in a different engagement, and I studied it for 30 years afterward. Mark closed that channel and opened a second one. Nolan, break off your current engagement. I need you at coordinates I'm transmitting now. Target, hybrid commander, male, approximately 180 centimeters. Gray combat suit with red shoulder markings. He's directing the central swarm formation from the interior. He will be at those coordinates in 3 minutes. Nolan's voice came back immediately, without hesitation. Confirmed. Mark heard the change in the drive signature of his father's flight, the specific acceleration pattern of someone who had just changed direction at speed. He did not watch to verify. He knew it was done. Oliver. He found his brother still hovering 20 meters away, watching him with an expression that had not resolved into anything identifiable. 40 degrees solar north, 1,700 kilometers. Female hybrid commander, dual-wielding Viltrum-forged blades. She's running the right flank coordination. Kill her and come back. Oliver's mouth opened. He was processing something, the order or the voice giving it, or both. Oliver, not sharper. Just direct. 1,700 kilometers. Go. Oliver went. Mark turned back to the tactical overview in his heads-up display, the GDA-adjacent coalition technology that Alan had integrated into their suit systems for this engagement. He looked at the battle map the way a chess player looks at a board, not searching for moves, but confirming that the moves he had already identified were still available. They were. 4 positions had updated in the 30 seconds since his first orders. All 4 updates were consistent with what he had expected. He opened a third channel. Alan, Your technical unit, the signals team on the command ship. I need them to jam a specific frequency range. I'm transmitting the parameters now." That's a pause. He could hear Alan processing. That's their coordination frequency. "How did you—" "It won't hold the jam for long. Thragg will have a contingency frequency, but the time between when the jam hits and when the contingency activates, that's approximately 40 seconds. During those 40 seconds, every hybrid in the swarm formation reverts to autonomous decision-making." Mark watched a cluster of coalition fighters taking fire from 3 hybrids simultaneously, outnumbered, losing ground. He added them to his list. Autonomous Viltrumite combat instinct is powerful and nearly impossible to suppress. Autonomous Viltrumite combat instinct without coordination is also predictable. They will each individually advance on the nearest coalition unit. They will not maintain formation geometry. And if they're not maintaining formation geometry, then they're not a swarm. They're individuals. And your forces know how to fight individuals. He tracked the coalition fighters still taking fire. Signal Lieutenant Voss on the 3rd Battalion to pull his unit back and regroup at the debris cluster to his north. He's about to lose 3 soldiers to a flanking move that he can't see from his position. A 15-second delay, then Voss confirms he's moving. The jam hit the hybrid communication frequency. The effect was not dramatic from the outside. There was no visual change, no explosion, no signal that anything had occurred. What changed was the movement of the swarm formation, and it changed in exactly the way Mark had described. The tight, coordinated geometry of the advance began to dissolve. Units that had been maintaining specific spacing began to drift. Without the coordination signals, each hybrid fighter defaulted to the most immediate target rather than the assigned target. The formation became a mob. A very powerful mob. The hybrids were not weaker for being uncoordinated. They were Viltrumite stock fighters, and they were formidable individually. But the specific terror of the swarm formation had been its geometry, the way it compressed coalition forces from multiple angles, simultaneously denying the ability to focus defense in any single direction. Without that geometry, the coalition forces could pick directions, could concentrate, could fight. Alan's voice came back with something in it that had not been there before. "The formation is breaking. The jam will last 38 more seconds," Mark said. "Tell your commanders to use the time to reposition, not to advance. When the contingency frequency activates and the formation reestablishes, I want your people in better defensive geometry, not committed to an advance." He watched Lieutenant Voss's unit reach the debris cluster. 4 seconds later, 3 hybrids arrived at the position Voss had just vacated, coming in from the angle Voss couldn't see from. The flanking move Mark had identified, they hit empty space. Their momentum carried them into the debris field, and they spent 12 seconds extracting themselves and reorienting. 12 seconds was not nothing. In the coalition's 3rd Battalion, a single soldier, a Ragnarian fighter, 6-limbed, one of Alan's most experienced infantry, had been backed against a burning ship hull by 2 hybrids, his weapon disabled, his armor compromised. He had approximately 4 seconds before the closer hybrid reached him. The hybrid stopped, not because of the Ragnarian's efforts, not because of anything in his immediate tactical situation, because the hybrid, operating on autonomous instinct without coordination signals, had simultaneously detected a higher priority target, 40 meters to its left. A cluster of coalition soldiers who had bunched together during the formation collapse, presenting a more concentrated threat signature. The hybrid turned left. The Ragnarian pressed himself against the hull and breathed. He did not know why he was alive. He would not know for some time that the answer was because someone had known exactly where he was and exactly what would save him, and had arranged for that thing to occur without ever looking directly at him. Alan pulled up the battle map with updated positions. The 3 hybrid commanders were tagged. Nolan was 90 seconds from the first. Oliver was already at 1,700 kilometers and closing. The eastern flanking force had committed to the vacated position and were now engaged in a 4-minute reorientation. The swarm formation was fragmented. The coalition forces that had been 90 seconds from routing were now holding. Alan sat with that for a moment. He had commanded coalition forces for years. He had planned engagements against Viltrumite tier opponents, had developed doctrine for fighting species that could tear warships apart with their hands, had built a military structure from a diplomatic organization through sheer force of will and hard-earned experience. He was, by any legitimate assessment, one of the most capable commanders the Coalition had produced, a fighter who had made himself into a strategist because the universe had demanded it. He watched the battle map update in real time, each update confirming the accuracy of intelligence that should not have been available. And he understood with complete clarity that whatever was happening with Mark was not something his existing frameworks could explain. He opened a private channel. "Mark, I need to ask you something. Later. It's important." "Later, Alan. I have 7 more things to do in the next 3 minutes, and this conversation is not one of them." A pause, briefer than the others. "You're doing fine. Keep following the orders and you'll understand the shape of this in approximately 11 minutes. Alan closed his end of the channel. He looked at his tactical officers, 8 Coalition species represented around the command console, all of them watching their boards, all of them processing the same impossibility with varying degrees of success. One of them, a tail-screen analyst who had been with Alan for 6 years, met his eyes. "Sir," she said, "the battle analysis is showing a 93% probability of Coalition tactical success in the next 15 minutes. 20 minutes ago, it was showing 14%. "I know," Alan said. "That's not—" "I know," Alan said again. He watched Mark's signal on the tactical overlay, stationary at the center of the engagement zone. Not fighting, not moving, directing. The signal of a single combatant, standing in the middle of a battle, managing it the way a conductor manages an orchestra. 1,000 kilometers away, Oliver arrived at the designated coordinates and found the female hybrid commander exactly where Mark had said she would be. He hit her from the right at full velocity. It took him 40 seconds. She was good, genuinely good, and she had half a second of warning before impact and used it to avoid a clean kill strike. He adjusted, engaged properly, and finished it. He opened comms. "Done. Coming back." "Good," Mark said. "On your way back, pass through the central debris field on the following heading." A coordinate string followed, and locate a hybrid unit of approximately 30 fighters staging for a second-wave ambush on Alan's command ship. Disrupt them. You don't have to kill them all, you just need to make them late. A beat. "How do you know they're there?" Oliver said. "I'll explain later." "Go." Oliver went. The central swarm formation lost its second commander when Nolan arrived at the designated coordinates and found the male hybrid exactly where Mark had said. The formation's wobble, already present from the communication jam's effects, deepened. The tight geometry had relied on 3 command signals to maintain itself. It now had 1. Mark watched the formation begin to collapse. He watched the Coalition units that had been retreating stabilize, then hold, then tentatively advance as the pressure against them decreased. He watched the flanking force Thragg had positioned with such precision arrive at its ambush coordinates and find nothing there to ambush. He watched the battle map's probability assessments begin to shift. He was not finished. He had 4 more orders to give in the next 6 minutes. The battle was stabilizing, not won. There was significant fighting still ahead, and significant casualties still coming, and a specific problem that tactics could not address, the problem that was sitting in a command position somewhere in the Thraxan formation, watching his battle plan come apart in ways that should not have been possible. Mark had been waiting for Thragg to notice for approximately 8 minutes. He looked at the mass of hybrid fighters that were still pressing the Coalition center, the largest concentration of them, a knot of close-quarters combat that was grinding through Coalition soldiers even amid the swarm formation's deterioration. He rolled his neck once, cracked his knuckles. The gesture was entirely without drama, the movement of someone setting down a set of tools and picking up a different set. He flew into the swarm. The first hybrid came at him head-on. Mark stepped offline by 4 inches. The hybrid's momentum carried it through the space where he'd been. He put his palm flat against the back of its skull as it passed and accelerated it, a small addition of force in the direction it was already traveling, enough to drive its face into the hull of a burning Coalition ship at a speed its Viltrumite durability would survive and its consciousness would not. It hit the hull and went still. 1 motion, 1.4 seconds. The second hybrid was already mid-swing when Mark turned back. A right-hand strike, fully committed, everything behind it. Against young Mark, fighting his 20th engagement of the day on depleted reserves and fraying reflexes, This strike would have landed, and it would have cost something. Against the person currently occupying young Mark's body, it was information. Confirmation of the hybrid's dominant hand, its balance point, the specific mechanics of how it generated power. He slipped it. He drove two knuckles into the precise point where the hybrid's jaw met its skull on the left side. Not a haymaker, not a power strike. Something more specific than that. A focused impact to the occipital nerve cluster, delivered at the angle and with the calibration that 5 centuries of refining this technique had produced. The hybrid's eyes went blank. Its motor control cut out completely. Its body went from fully engaged combat posture to total limpness in under a second, drifting away in the zero-gravity environment, alive, unhurt in any lasting sense, simply absent from the fight for the next 90 seconds. The third and fourth hybrids arrived simultaneously from his left and right flanks. They had coordinated, not with communication signals, those were still jammed, but through the simple spatial awareness of fighters who had trained together and understood positioning. One high, one low. Standard double approach, the assumption being that addressing one necessarily exposed the flank to the other. Mark went between them. He went straight up through the space between their two vectors, fast enough that both of their strikes hit each other's arms instead of him. While they were processing that, a quarter second of recalibration, the combat equivalent of a stumble, he came back down and hit the lower hybrid in the same nerve cluster location. Same result. The higher one he caught by the ankle as it tried to re-engage, used its own flight-generated momentum as a lever, and swung it in a controlled arc into a third hybrid that had been approaching from 11 o'clock. The collision was significant. Both went into the hull of a dead ship and stayed there. Mark turned. There were 11 more hybrids in his immediate engagement zone, and they were watching him, not attacking, watching. 4 seconds ago, 5 of their number had been active combatants. Now 3 were unconscious, and 2 were stunned, and none of it had happened the way Viltrumite combat was supposed to happen. Viltrumite combat was supposed to happen with impact and blood, and the grinding, mutual attrition of overwhelming force meeting overwhelming force. What had just happened had produced none of those things. What had just happened was quiet, and fast, and had the specific quality of things going wrong in ways that could not immediately be analyzed. Mark looked at them. He was not breathing hard. He had not elevated his respiration during the engagement, because the engagement had not required it. He was applying technique, not exertion. The distinction was not a small one. He waited 2 seconds, giving them time to attack, giving them the option, watching which of the 11 moved first, and with what. The largest of them moved first. It was the correct choice from a tactical standpoint. Highest mass, most durability, least likely to go down clean. It came in with a different approach than the first 5. Not a committed strike, a grapple attempt, understanding at some level that the striking approach was not producing results. It wanted to get its hands on him, get inside his range, use its size advantage in a clinch. Mark let it get close. He let it get close, and then he slipped inside the grapple at the last moment, got his own hands into position first, and applied the wrist nerve compression grip that he had developed over decades of fighting beings with Viltrumite tier wrist strength. The grip did not require him to be stronger than the hybrid. It required him to apply precise pressure to 2 specific points simultaneously, disrupting the neural pathway between the hybrid's intent and its hand's ability to execute that intent. The grapple that would have been irresistible became a hand that could not close. He stepped through the failed grapple, positioned himself at the hybrid's back, and hit the nerve cluster. Number 6. The remaining 10 came at once. This was the correct response. He acknowledged it without needing to verbalize it. Mass simultaneous engagement was the appropriate counter to an opponent who was defeating sequential attacks. He was not surprised by it. He had planned for it. He moved, not fast in the way that looked fast, not the blurring velocity of young Mark running purely on Viltrumite speed, with no technique behind it. He moved with economy, always to the position that required the fewest subsequent movements to address the next threat. Always at the angle that put one hybrid between himself and 2 others, always using the geometry of their own approach vectors as obstacles for each other. He put 2 hybrids into each other before they reached him. He used a third as a rotating shield against a 4th strike, positioning it in the way by grabbing its collar and turning it, so that the 4th hybrid's committed punch hit its ally in the kidney and left the attacker overextended. He took 1 strike, An elbow to the left side of his jaw from a hybrid that had come from below and behind. A good approach, tactically sound, and let it move his head with the impact, and came back with a palm strike to the hybrid's sternum that stopped its momentum completely and put it drifting backward. He did not deliver the nerve cluster strike to every engagement. Sometimes he simply hit them hard enough to remove them from the immediate fight without disabling them. A calculated force impact to a joint. A disruption of their balanced geometry in zero gravity that sent them spinning and unable to self-correct for several seconds. The nerve cluster strikes he reserved for the ones that needed to be stopped rather than delayed. 47 seconds. 10 more hybrids out of the engagement. He stopped. He was in the center of the cleared space, surrounded by drifting bodies. Alive, most of them recovering slowly, none of them an immediate problem. He looked at his hands for exactly 1 second. Then he looked up. From 300 meters above, Alan the alien had been watching. He had fought Viltrumites. He had fought them personally, in his capacity as one of the most powerful beings the Coalition had ever fielded, and he knew what Viltrumite combat looked like at its highest expression. He knew what Nolan Grayson looked like when he was fully engaged. 2,000 years of veteran ferocity, translated into overwhelming relentless force that wore opponents down and crushed them. What Mark was doing was not that. Mark was not fighting with Nolan's particular expression of power. He was not fighting with the aggressive forward pressure of a Viltrumite maximizing its natural advantages. He was fighting with something that Alan could not fully name, that his analytical frameworks kept reaching for and not quite grasping. Absence, he thought. That was the closest word. Mark was fighting with absence. He was never where the strikes were, the energy of each exchange always redirected or absorbed in a way that cost him less than it should. Every opponent's strength somehow turned into a problem for that opponent, rather than for him. The nerve cluster technique appeared twice in Alan's recording, flagged by his analytical systems as an unknown combat technique with 100% incapacitation rate in observed applications. 100%. Alan opened his record of the past 47 seconds and watched it again at quarter speed. On the command deck beside him, his tail-scrayan analyst was watching the same footage. She did not say anything. After a moment she looked at Alan. That technique, she said. The strike at the base of the skull. Where did he? Oliver arrived back from the disruption assignment. 1,700 kilometers out and back. Ambush disrupted. Hybrid staging unit 12 minutes behind schedule. He came to a stop 40 meters from where Mark was hovering above the cleared engagement zone, watching the wider battle, running his tactical overview. He looked at the drifting hybrids, at the complete systematic nature of the clearing, at his brother. Mark, he said. Mark turned to look at him. The full attention, the quiet eyes. Oliver had been fighting since before he fully understood what fighting meant. He had grown up inside war. He had benchmarked himself against every opponent he encountered, including his brother, including his father, building an internal calibration of where he stood and what the ceiling was. The person looking at him had no ceiling he could locate. "What happened to you?" Oliver said. Mark held his gaze for 3 seconds, not calculating a response, just looking at his brother with an expression that contained something Oliver couldn't read, something that might have been affection and might have been grief, and might have been the particular quality of looking at someone who was very young, from a great distance. "Later," Mark said. "I need you to, Mark, take the following coordinates and locate the third hybrid commander. He's running the reserve formation. Without him, the reserve won't know when to engage, and they'll either stay out of the fight entirely or commit at the wrong moment. Both outcomes work for us." He transmitted the coordinates. "He'll be in the center of the reserve cluster. Heavily guarded, you'll have to go through the guard units to reach him. Can you do that?" Oliver looked at the coordinates, looked at his brother. "Can you do that?" Mark said again. The same tone, not impatient, not dismissive. The tone of someone managing multiple problems simultaneously and needing confirmation of this one so they could move to the next. "Yes," Oliver said. "Good. Go." Oliver went. Nolan came in from the north 3 seconds later. He arrived at a deceleration that was controlled and precise, the arrival of someone who had been where they were sent, and done what they were sent to do, and had returned for further instructions. He stopped beside Mark and looked at him with a different quality of attention than Oliver's. Nolan was old. He had not been watching his son benchmark himself against older fighters and recalibrate. He had been watching human beings and Viltrumites and every species between them for 2,000 years, and he had developed, over those 2,000 years, a sense for things that were not what they appeared to be. He looked at his son. He did not say, "What happened to you?" He had felt what was in Oliver's question, and it was not the question he would have asked. What he said was, "You're not 20 years old anymore." Mark looked at him. "No," he said. "I'm not." A pause. In the mid-distance, the battle continued its new shape, the shape that had been forced on it by 7 orders delivered in 4 minutes. "Tell me what you need," Nolan said. Mark turned back to the battlefield. He had 4 minutes before the next critical juncture. He began to explain. Behind him, in the middle distance, a cluster of the surviving hybrids from his cleared zone had regrouped. They were communicating, not through the jammed signals, through direct contact and gesture, the old methods. They were coordinating. They were preparing a second approach, different from the first, more sophisticated. They were going to get Ursal. She came from below, not because below was tactically advantageous in zero gravity, it wasn't, not inherently, but because Ursal had been watching Mark for 4 minutes from a distance, studying his engagement patterns, and she had identified what she believed was his blind spot. His attention was consistently oriented toward the main engagement zone, the tactical overview, the broader battle he was managing. He was looking out, not down. She came from below. She covered the distance at full speed, blades forward, the cortanium alloy catching the distant starlight as she closed. The blades were real weapons, not ornamental, not ceremonial. Cortanium was one of the few materials capable of meaningfully penetrating Viltrumite density flesh. She had used them in 40 engagements across 3 campaigns. She had never faced an opponent who had seen her use them before. Before she arrived, Mark had already seen her coming on the battlefield overlay, had identified her approach vector 6 seconds before she committed to it, and had rotated his position by 11 degrees. He was not where the blades were going. The momentum of her charge carried her through empty space. Her blades hit nothing. The force she had built over 300 meters of acceleration had nothing to spend itself on. She pivoted. It was a good pivot, fast, technically clean, the immediate correction of a fighter who had trained for exactly this outcome. She came back at him from the recovery. Blades repositioned. He stepped offline again, minimal movement, the smallest displacement that took him out of the blade's path. He gave her nothing to read in it, no theatrical dodge, no visible anticipation. He simply was not where the blades were, and the absence was entirely unremarkable. She attacked 6 more times. He did not attack back. He evaded, each time with the same quality of minimal, unhurried displacement. Never more movement than the situation required. Never a position that wasn't already ready for the next evasion. She came at him with 6 different approaches, 6 different geometries, adjusting and adapting after each failed strike with the intelligence and training of a fighter who had been doing this her entire life. He was not there for any of them. She stopped. She was breathing hard, not from exhaustion, from effort, from the specific expenditure of attacking a target at full commitment 6 times and making no contact. She held her blades in the guard position and looked at him. He was looking at her the way you look at a demonstration that is proceeding as expected. She attacked again. The 7th strike, not a new geometry, a return to the first approach, the one that had ended more fights than any other technique she possessed. If he had adapted to the first 6, perhaps the 7th, the original, would find something different. He caught the blade, between 2 fingers of his right hand. The strike was fully committed. Ursal's complete force behind it, the cortanium edge traveling at a velocity that should have made the catch physically impossible. His fingers closed around the flat of the blade an inch from the tip, and the blade did not move. She pulled. Everything she had, both hands now on the hilt, her entire Viltrumite tier strength applied to the retrieval of a weapon being held by 2 fingers. The blade did not move. She pulled harder. She felt the cortanium begin to flex, the blade itself bending slightly under the competing forces, which should not have been possible, which should not have been a thing the material did. But the grip did not release, and the blade did not come free. Mark examined it briefly. He turned it slightly in his fingers, assessing the edge geometry, the alloy composition visible in the way the light moved across the metal. His expression was the expression of someone looking at a thing they find mildly interesting. "Cortanium weave over a carbon core," he said. "Good construction. This was made on Viltrum. You can tell by the edge geometry. The manufacturing process that produces this profile was only used in the Eastern Forge complexes, and those won't survive the next 4 decades. Or they will be, he said, 40 years from now. He snapped the blade. The cortanium, the material that could cut Viltrumite flesh, the material whose edge had opened wounds in beings that conventional weapons could not mark, broke between his hands the way a piece of rigid plastic breaks. The sound it made was dry and clean and final. He dropped both pieces. They drifted away in the zero-gravity environment, end over end. Ursula looked at the broken pieces of her blade. She attacked barehanded. The first strike connected. He let it, moved his head with it to reduce the force transfer, but let the contact happen. Her fist hit his jaw and the impact registered, and he felt it and he turned his head back and looked at her. The second strike connected too. His cheekbone this time. She felt it land solidly, felt the impact travel back up through her arm the way a real hit feels, not the nothing of hitting air. He did not move his feet. He stood there and absorbed 2 of Ursula's best strikes and looked at her with the same expression he'd had when she was pulling at the blade. She threw the third strike. He caught her wrist. One hand, around her wrist, the grip closing before the strike extended to full reach. She felt the grip engage, and she pulled immediately, not committed yet, testing the resistance. The resistance was total. Her wrist was held in a position of his choosing, and the hand that held it had not changed its position by a millimeter. She committed to the pull, full strength, feet finding purchase against nothing, body torquing to generate maximum extraction force. He held her at arm's length with one hand, examined her. Not cruelly. Without cruelty was the critical thing, the thing that was worse than cruelty because cruelty she could have responded to. He examined her with the calm assessment of someone looking at a situation they had anticipated and finding it accurate. Above them, in a command ship that should have been well outside visual range of this engagement, Thragg watched on a long-range visual feed. He watched his finest child, the one he had trained personally, the one whose combat development he had overseen from her first year, the one whose ferocity had cleared entire coalition units in the early stages of this engagement. Held at arm's length by one hand, unable to move, he watched the boy hold her there. He watched the boy begin to speak. Mark looked at Ursula. He looked at her with the complete, dispassionate clarity of someone who has already been through this and knows what it costs both of them, and is doing it anyway because it is necessary. "Your father told you the Empire is strong," he said. His voice was not raised. In vacuum, without atmosphere, his voice was reaching her only through the vibration conduit of his grip on her wrist and the suit's transmission systems. It was an intimate register for a devastating thing to be said in. "Count the dead on your side. Count them against ours, then tell me what strong means." She pulled at his grip. The grip did not change. "You were bred for this war. You and every hybrid in this formation, built specifically for this engagement, for Thragg's army, for Thragg's fight." He watched her face while he said it, watched for the thing he knew was in there, beneath the rage and the training and the absolute loyalty. What the Empire needed was the next generation of its people. What you were given was the next generation of his soldiers. Do you understand the difference? "You don't know what you're talking about," she said. Her voice was controlled. "Barely. I know what the breeding records show. I've read them. I will read them, 40 years from now when I have access to Thragg's private archives. Every decision in your lineage was optimized for combat yield, not for the Empire's continuity. He built you to fight his war, not to outlast it." She tried a different approach, not pulling now, a rotation, trying to find the angle that would relieve the pressure of the grip. There was no angle. The grip was applied to a specific point that rotation could not relieve without first reaching a position her joint structure could not achieve. "He sent us into this battle knowing the odds," Mark continued. His voice had not changed. No emotion had entered it. "He sent you into an engagement he calculated as a 73% probability of total loss for his hybrid forces, not because he believed you would win, because a loss that cost the coalition significant casualties extends the war, and an extended war is better for Thragg's political position than a negotiated peace. You were not sent here to win. You were sent here to be expensive to kill." "You're lying," she said. He released her wrist. She did not immediately attack. She pulled her arm back, the momentum of anticipated resistance carrying her a half step backward. When the resistance vanished, she looked at her wrist, at the pieces of her blade drifting away in the mid-distance. At the boy in front of her, who had held her one-handed and was now standing with his arm lowered, not in any guard position, completely open. "I'm not asking you to believe me," Mark said. "I'm asking you to look at this battle. Look at what's happening. Look at how many of your siblings are down, and how many of ours are down, and then ask yourself what outcome your father designed this engagement to produce." She looked at the battlefield. She was Ursal. She had tactical intelligence, genuine strategic awareness. She had been fighting this engagement and monitoring it simultaneously. She had seen the formation collapse. She had seen the communication disruption. She had seen 3 commanders go down at precisely the moments they were most critical. She had seen her father's plan come apart. "Go back," Mark said. "Go back to your siblings and tell them what happened here. Tell them about the blade. Tell them exactly what happened when you attacked me." He paused, not to hurt their confidence, to give them information. They deserve to know what they're actually in. Not dismissively, he simply had the next thing to do, and the next thing was not here. He opened his comms as he turned. Ursal stayed where she was. She looked at the broken pieces of the Cortanium blade drifting slowly away from her, at the backs of the hybrids who had pulled away from the main engagement to send her here, at the battle still ongoing, still generating its cascade of consequences from orders given 20 minutes ago by a single fighter who had not moved from the center of the engagement zone. Something was happening in her that had no combat name. Rage was still there. It would be there for a long time. But through the rage, cracking it the way ice cracks stone by going into the existing faults and expanding. Doubt. The specific, devastating doubt that arrives when your certainty about the shape of your world is confronted with facts that the certainty cannot absorb. She turned. She went back. She did not speak when she arrived. The hybrids who had sent her looked at her face and read something in it that they did not have language for either. In his command chip, Thragg watched the feed from the long-range visual. He watched his daughter return to the formation without a body, without a victory, without the broken half-breed she had gone to retrieve. He watched her face on the magnified feed. He set down the data pad he had been holding. He had been holding it for 4 minutes without looking at it because his eyes had not left the visual feed. He stood up. His command staff, arrayed around the operations table, looked up at him. They had been receiving reports for 20 minutes. They knew the shape of the situation. None of them had wanted to say it directly to Thragg. He did not need them to say it. He looked at the visual feed one more time, at the boy hovering at the coalition's center, already on his comms, already managing the next phase of a battle that was no longer Thragg's, and his jaw tightened by 2 millimeters. He walked toward the launch bay. The first report came from the left flank commander. Thragg read it standing at the launch bay entrance, having paused before committing to the transit. The report was 3 sentences. The ambush units had arrived at their target coordinates and found empty space. The Coalition Eastern Battalion that should have been there had repositioned 14 minutes ago. The ambush units were now committed to a reorientation that would take them out of the engagement for an estimated 4 minutes. He read it twice, then he set it aside and called up the next one. The second report was from his communications officer. The coordination frequency had been jammed for 40 seconds, 22 minutes ago. The contingency frequency had been activated successfully, and formation coordination had resumed, but the 40-second window had produced significant structural deterioration in the swarm formation's geometry. The geometry had not fully recovered. 3 subformations were still operating with autonomous decision protocols rather than coordinated ones. He set that one aside, too. He was building a picture. The third report was from the Central Formation's senior surviving commander. Senior because the original senior commander was dead, which was itself the subject of the report. Nolan Grayson had arrived at his position with precise knowledge of his coordinates, not approximate knowledge, not a search pattern that happened to find him. Grayson had flown directly to him, had known where he was. Thragg looked at the report for a long time. He called up the 4th report without setting down the 3rd. The right flank coordination commander was dead, killed by Oliver Grayson at coordinates that were... He stopped. He read the coordinates. He pulled up the formation map from 22 minutes ago and found the position the right flank commander had been occupying at the time of her death. He cross-referenced it against the route Oliver Grayson had taken to reach her. Oliver Grayson had flown directly to those coordinates. From the main engagement zone, 1,700 kilometers dead reckoning. No search, no course correction. Straight line. Thragg set down both reports. He was in the launch bay now, had walked through it without consciously deciding to continue walking, and he stood at the edge of the launch aperture, looking at the engagement zone in the distance. The battle was visible as a region of motion and light, too far for individual combatants to resolve, but the shape of it was clear. The shape of it was wrong. The coalition was advancing. Not on all fronts, not yet, but on 3 specific vectors, at precisely the points where his formation had been compromised by the commander losses and the communication disruption and the reorientation of the flanking units. 3 vectors of advance, all developing simultaneously, all pointed at junctions in his defensive formation that only became vulnerable when the preceding events had already occurred. The preceding events that had been engineered, deliberately, with foreknowledge. He called his intelligence officer. The coordination frequency compromise. How was it jammed? What methodology? The jam was technically precise. It targeted a 9 kHz window inside our operating range. A broad-spectrum jam would have been detectable in advance and easy to engineer a workaround for. This targeted a specific window that only produces results if you know exactly which frequency we operate on. A pause. His intelligence officer was careful, had survived 20 years of service to Thragg by being careful. Within the Empire's current command structure, 11 individuals. Within the coalition, assuming no penetration of our communications security, none. The frequency was established in a closed session 2 years ago. It was never transmitted in any interceptable format. And yet, the officer confirmed, Thragg closed the channel. He stood at the launch aperture, and he thought. He was not accustomed to needing to think in this mode, the mode of confronting a situation that his existing models could not account for. He had spent centuries operating from a position of complete informational dominance. He knew Viltrumite physiology better than any living being. He knew coalition tactics, had studied them, had developed counters to every doctrine Alan the Alien had ever deployed. He knew his hybrid army's capabilities with the intimate precision of someone who had overseen their development from inception. He did not know how the boy knew the frequency. He did not know how the boy had known his ambush coordinates. He did not know how the boy had known where his commanders were. He did not know, and not knowing was a physical sensation, a cold, specific pressure in his chest that he had not experienced in a very long time, when a weapons development he had not anticipated had briefly threatened to alter the power balance of a distant engagement. He had solved that problem in 4 hours. He had identified the methodology, developed a counter, and erased the threat. He looked at the battle from the launch aperture and tried to identify the methodology, the possibilities, enumerated and assessed. Coalition intelligence penetration of Imperial communications, possible in theory, he had to acknowledge it. But the frequency had never been transmitted in an interceptable format. The coordinates of his commanders were not stored in any system with coalition access. The reserve formation's command structure was not. He stopped. He returned to the premise. What if the knowledge was not gathered? What if the knowledge was carried? He thought about what that meant. Carried from where? Carried from when? He did not have a framework for the answer. What he had was the footage of the boy's movement and the nerve cluster technique applied 3 times in sequence, and the knowledge of his own frequency that should not have been available, and the coordinates of his commanders, delivered with the certainty of someone who did not need to check. He stood at the launch aperture for 11 seconds without moving. What he was experiencing was not fear. He documented this to himself precisely because precision was how he operated. It was not fear. It was the cold recognition of a problem he could not currently solve, combined with the strategic understanding that unsolved problems and active engagements grew more expensive with time. The correct response to this recognition was to remove the variable. The boy was the variable. He had made this decision before the Ursal engagement. He was reaffirming it now with better information. The boy had perfect foreknowledge of this battle. The boy had techniques that should not exist in a fighter this young. The boy was managing the coalition army with the authority of a commander who had held that role for decades. Whatever the boy was, whatever had happened to produce him, the tactical answer was identical. Remove him from the engagement. He would go himself. Not because he enjoyed the direct engagement, though he did. The honest assessment was that he did. But because he had watched 3 of his commanders targeted and killed with precise knowledge of their positions. And he understood that sending subordinates against a being with that quality of foreknowledge was sending them to be neutralized in sequence, while the boy used the interim to do something else. You did not send incremental solutions against a problem that was defeating incremental solutions. You sent the final solution first. He reviewed the Ursol report one more time. Not her failure. He had processed her failure already and filed its implications. He reviewed the details she had included in her debrief, the one she had communicated through a gesture rather than a statement, because she had not known how to say it with words. She had been released. The boy had held her with one hand for 45 seconds and then released her. He had not hurt her. He had not demonstrated dominance through injury. Through the complete, undramatic communication, that injury was his to choose, and he had chosen not to. That was a specific message. Directed at Ursol, yes, but also, and Thragg understood this with the clarity of someone who had managed armies and politics for centuries, directed at him. I can hold your best child with one hand. I chose not to break her. Notice the choice. Thragg noticed it. He walked to the launch position. His command staff tracked him with their eyes and said nothing. They had received every report. They knew what he was doing. None of them would question it. He looked at the engagement zone, found the position in the overlay where the boy was hovering, managing the battle that had been his until 25 minutes ago. He gave one order to his staff before he launched. Signal the army. Clear the coordinates around the boy's current position. Pull everything back. Give us space. His communications officer opened the channel. The signal went out. In the engagement zone, the hybrid forces began to pull back around Mark's position, creating space, a cleared zone in the center of the battle. Thragg launched. Mark watched the hybrid forces pull back. They moved cleanly, disciplined withdrawal, not a rout, the specific quality of soldiers following an order they had been trained to follow without needing to understand it. The cleared zone expanded around him in a radius of approximately 400 meters. Hybrids and coalition forces, both backing away from the center, the battle redistributing itself to the perimeter while the middle became empty space. Mark had countermanded the coalition advance the moment he saw the withdrawal begin. 2 words on the command channel: hold positions. Allen had complied without question, which was a thing Mark noted and filed. 3 days ago, Allen would have asked why. Something had shifted in the last 25 minutes in how Allen processed Mark's instructions. He looked at the cleared zone. He unfolded his arms. Thragg arrived at combat velocity. Not from the direction of the command ship. He had taken an angular approach, using a debris field as a velocity screen, arriving from 40 degrees off-axis from where his launch point would have suggested. A tactical approach. Not that it mattered. Mark had already rotated 11 degrees to face the correct vector before Thragg cleared the debris field. Thragg's opening strike was a right-hand blow, delivered at his full velocity. No wind-up, no preparatory movement. The kind of strike that opened with everything because Thragg had never needed to hold anything back. The force behind it was the force of a being who had spent millennia accumulating combat mass and experience. It had leveled structures. It had ended fights in a single contact. Mark was not there. He moved offline by 8 inches. Exactly 8 inches, the precise displacement that took him out of the strike's path, without giving him any unnecessary additional distance to cover when he counterattacked. Thragg's fist hit vacuum. His arm extended to full reach and found nothing. Thragg recovered immediately. His reflexes were extraordinary, the product of the same centuries of refinement that Mark's movement economy reflected. He pulled the extended arm back and pivoted in the same motion, turning to find Mark 3 meters away, hovering, looking at him. "Hello, Thragg," Mark said. "I've been looking forward to this." Thragg attacked. The combination he used was one he had developed over centuries. 3 strikes in a specific sequence, each one geometrically positioned to make the other 2 more dangerous. The first strike forced a defensive response that opened the angle for the second. The second strike required a repositioning that made the defender's guard unavailable for the third. Against every opponent who had survived the first strike, the combination had produced contact. Against most of those opponents, the third strike had been decisive. Mark blocked the first strike by changing its angle rather than absorbing its force. His forearm came up not to stop the blow, but to redirect it, turning Thragg's drive sideways so the force passed beside him. He slipped the second, a minimal head movement that let it pass his ear. He caught the third on his forearm in a block that sent the force sideways again, and in the same motion he turned his forearm's redirect into a counterattack, a single strike delivered to Thragg's exposed ribs with his full extension behind it. The impact registered. Thragg felt it and backed off a half step to assess. He attacked again. Not the same combination. He was not a fighter who repeated what had failed. He used the contingency, a more complex sequence, 5 movements rather than 3, designed for opponents who had survived the primary. He had used it many times across centuries of serious combat. Mark blocked it more easily than the first one. Not because Mark was faster than Thragg. Thragg was as fast as anything alive. Because Mark had watched himself fight through the contingency combination for the first time, 50 years from now, in the original timeline, and had spent decades afterward analyzing the counter. He had the counter as thoroughly as he had his own name. The contingency variant, Mark said. His voice was conversational, not taunting, not performing. Informational. You only use it when someone survives your opening sequence. I know every combination you have, Thragg. I know them the way you know your own hands. Thragg did not respond with words. He attacked a third time. Something different, not a combination from his standard repertoire, but an improvised sequence built around what he had learned in the first 2 exchanges. He was adapting. He was good enough and experienced enough to adapt in real time. Mark met it with a counter he had prepared for, and while the counter was completing, he delivered the laryngeal disruption strike, his left hand's first 2 knuckles, precisely placed on a specific point of Thragg's throat. A strike calibrated to disrupt the vocal structure that Viltrumites used for sonic resonance at close range, without causing lasting damage. Thragg's voice cut out. It cut out completely, not reduced, not muffled. Gone. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. He reached up and touched his throat with one hand. Involuntarily, the automatic response of a body, suddenly without a capability it had always had. He stopped. The movement was small, a fraction-second pause in his attack flow. The first time in this engagement that Thragg had been made to stop. Mark watched him process it. Watched the moment of inventory. What just happened? What does it affect? How does it change the engagement parameters? Play out in the quality of Thragg's stillness. The laryngeal structure is 3 millimeters anterior to where most fighters target when they go for the throat. Mark said, most strikes either hit the larynx itself, which causes pain but not functional disruption at Viltrumite durability levels, or they go too deep and hit the tracheal cartilage, which doesn't affect resonance at all. The exact point produces a temporary nerve compression that takes the resonance function offline. It lasts about 4 minutes. He paused. You've never been hit there before because nobody has known where it was. I found it by accident the first time. I spent 30 years refining the placement. Thragg attacked. Not a combination this time. Not technique. Pure force. The decision to stop engaging with the specificity of this exchange and overwhelm it with volume. He came forward without a planned sequence, simply driving, accepting whatever he absorbed to stay inside Mark's range and keep landing. It was the tactical choice of someone who had identified that their technical approach was not producing the expected results, and had defaulted to the resource they were certain of. Mark moved, not away, laterally, constantly, keeping himself at angles where Thragg had to keep adjusting. He absorbed 3 strikes in this phase, one to his left shoulder that produced a real impact, one glancing off his right forearm, one to his hip that he had failed to fully redirect. He acknowledged the damage. These were Thragg-level strikes even partially landed, and partially landed was a different category from what any other opponent could deliver. His healing factor was running. He noted it and continued. He kept talking, that opening combination. You used it on my father. A sidestep. You've used it on every significant opponent for the past 200 years. It's your signature, a lateral displacement. An emperor shouldn't have signatures. Signatures are how you get read. You've spent millennia being the strongest thing in every room you've entered, he continued. The talking was not performance. It was psychological methodology, precise and purposeful. He was introducing information that would propagate into Thragg's decision-making and degrade it. When you're always the strongest, you never have to develop real technique. You develop patterns. Patterns that work because nothing can survive them long enough to find the counter. A block, a redirection, a half-step. I survived long enough. Thragg hit him clean. A right-hand drive that Mark had read late, or had allowed to land, Thragg could not determine which, that connected with his left shoulder at significant force. Mark moved with it, used the momentum to generate distance, came back without taking a full reset. Your right shoulder, Mark said. He was repositioning as he spoke, finding the angle he wanted, the one that was damaged in a campaign over a century ago. The structural compromise was never fully addressed. You had the healing, but the deep tissue repair left scar mass in the rotator assembly. He moved into a position slightly to Thragg's left. You compensate beautifully. Most opponents would never notice. But after a committed right-hand strike, your follow-through carries your weight half a degree further left than your guard geometry expects. You've been doing it for a very long time. Thragg threw a right-hand strike. Not because Mark had manipulated him into it. Thragg was too experienced for simple manipulation. He threw it because it was the correct strike for the exchange geometry, and he threw it knowing what Mark had just said, and he threw it calculating that even a tell he was aware of was better than abandoning his most powerful offensive line. As Thragg's right hand extended, Mark moved left. To Thragg's left, the side he had just explained would be slightly open during the follow-through recovery. He hit the damaged shoulder with everything, not a redirecting strike, a targeted, full extension impact designed to land on the specific structural compromise he had named. The force went into the scar tissue, into the deep assembly of the joint, into the exact point where centuries of incomplete repair had left a fault. The shoulder gave. A structural fracture, not a complete failure, not a joint separation, but a significant compromise in the load-bearing architecture of the right side. The sound of it was internal, conducted through Thragg's body, but the effect was immediate and visible. Thragg's right arm dropped by 3 inches, and the recovery from the strike was delayed by a full second as his body processed the new structural reality. Thragg made a sound. Without his vocal resonance, it was a compressed, airless exhalation. Involuntary, the body's automatic response to significant impact. He backed off. 1 step. 2. Both armies were watching. The cleared zone was surrounded by thousands of combatants on both sides, all of them still, all of them witnessing. Mark knew this, had known it when he allowed the cleared zone to form. The audience was not incidental. It was part of the work. Thragg looked at him across 4 meters of empty space. His right arm was 3 inches lower than it had started. His throat was still silent. He was standing with the complete composure of a being who had never shown damage and was not showing it now. But he was standing in a body that was carrying something it had not been carrying 5 minutes ago. He stopped moving. He looked at Mark with the full weight of millennia of assessment, and he saw something he had not seen before in any opponent. Mark looked back at him without urgency, without triumph, without any of the emotional signatures that ancient fighters learned to recognize and exploit. He cracked his knuckles. The gesture was simple and entirely unaffected. Then he began flying toward the sun. Fast, not at maximum velocity. He needed Thragg to be able to keep up, to follow, to pursue. He needed Thragg angry enough to pursue. "We're going to finish this where you always planned to finish me," Mark said over his shoulder. His voice was calm, almost pleasant. "Except this time, I planned it first." He waited 2 seconds to verify Thragg was following. Thragg was following. He turned toward the sun and accelerated. Mark had covered 200,000 kilometers before Thragg closed the gap. He let him close it. That was the precise thing. He was flying at a velocity Thragg could match, maintaining a distance that required pursuit without requiring desperation. Fast enough to establish the destination. Slow enough to keep Thragg in the engagement. Thragg came in from behind and above. The angular approach of a fighter who had assessed that straight-line pursuit was what Mark expected, and had added a variable. He was right that Mark expected it. He had not accounted for the fact that Mark had already adjusted his position in response to the variable before Thragg had committed to it. Mark felt the approach through the spatial awareness that 5 centuries of combat had built into something close to instinct. He dropped his velocity by 20% and banked left in the same motion. Thragg's intercept angle, calculated for a target moving at the previous velocity in the previous direction, arrived at empty space. He adjusted. Mark adjusted. They flew. The sun was ahead, not the abstract, distant star of deep space, but a presence now, filling the forward field of view with a light that was no longer simply bright, but had the quality of something that reached and demanded. The system's planets were behind them. The battle was behind them. Everything was behind them. The light hitting Mark's suit was already changing temperature. The thermal sensors in the suit's fabric registered the increase in increments. Not alarming yet, not even uncomfortable, but documentable. In 40 seconds, the increments would begin to compound. Thragg came in again. Same approach. He had not changed vectors this time, had anticipated Mark's previous adjustment and corrected for it. The grip came from behind, both hands, one on Mark's left arm and one at his collar. The grip was Thragg's full strength, and it was intended as a hold, not an attack. Intended to reverse the dynamic to make Thragg the one controlling direction, rather than following direction. Mark let the grip land. He let both of Thragg's hands close on him, let the momentum of the intercept carry Thragg into his back, and then he did not resist the grip. He used it. He folded into Thragg's approach vector instead of fighting it, turning the grapple into a shared momentum, and then he accelerated. Not against the hold, into it, in the direction Thragg had been pulling from. For 1 second, Thragg was pulling a person who had decided to go in the direction being pulled. The physics of it produced a moment of zero resistance, the sensation of a tug-of-war where one party suddenly stops resisting. Thragg's enormous pulling force, with nothing opposing it, overcommitted his position. Mark pivoted in the grip, got his left hand on Thragg's wrist, the specific nerve compression grip, applied to the point below the lateral condyle where pressure disrupted neural pathway coordination, and pulled Thragg's arm forward, while simultaneously accelerating toward the sun. Now Thragg was being towed. Not because Mark was stronger. He was not stronger than Thragg. That had never been the premise. He was holding Thragg's arm with a grip that Thragg could not break without first countering the nerve compression, and he was flying toward the sun at a velocity Thragg could match but could not exceed while the grip was engaged. Thragg worked the grip immediately. He understood the principle the moment it was applied. He had, after all, spent centuries accumulating combat knowledge, and his response was technically correct. Rotate the wrist inward to relieve the lateral pressure, then drive the elbow back to break the hold geometry. The rotation produced partial relief. Not complete relief, Mark adjusted the compression point as Thragg rotated, maintaining contact with the correct nerve cluster through the motion. The elbow drive landed on Mark's side, below his ribs, real force. He felt it register and absorbed it, and did not change his grip. Thragg hit him again and again. Each strike landed. He was not going to miss strikes at this distance, at this angle, with this level of access to Mark's body. Mark was taking damage in this phase, and he had known he would take damage in this phase, and the damage was within what he had budgeted for. The sun grew. At 150,000 kilometers, the light had gone from bright to total. There was no shadow. The illumination came from every angle simultaneously, reflected and re-reflected off their bodies, filling every contour. The temperature sensors were reporting sustained increases now. Not increments, but a curve, each second warmer than the last by a measurable margin. Mark's skin was reddening where the suit didn't cover, his face, his hands. The biological response to sustained thermal input. Not painful yet. Beginning. Thragg was experiencing the same. His suit was different. Viltrumite Imperial design, more thermal tolerant than Coalition-adjacent technology, but the environment was not making suit-to-suit distinctions. At sufficient temperature, material properties became secondary to duration. They were both going to absorb heat. The question was capacity and timeline. Mark had run those calculations. He had run them in the original timeline when he'd arrived at the sun injured and desperate. He had spent 50 years refining them with the precision of someone who survived once and wanted to understand exactly why. He was fresher than the original. He had sustained real damage in the battle, but not catastrophic damage. His Viltrumite durability was operating near its full capacity. His healing factor was running continuously on the accumulated strikes from Thragg in the past few minutes, managing the damage load in real time. Thragg was not as fresh. He had not fought a sustained engagement before arriving at the battle. He was the Grand Regent. He managed from command positions, but he had come to the fight after stress, after the psychological compound of watching his battle plan disassemble over 25 minutes, after the specific cost of fighting Mark in the cleared zone, not injured significantly, but not pristine. The margin was what mattered. Not who was stronger or more durable in absolute terms. Thragg still held those advantages. The margin of freshness, applied across the timeline of solar exposure, would produce a differential outcome. Thragg landed a strike to Mark's right side that genuinely rocked him. His right arm's compromised state had not stopped it from generating enormous force. Damaged and fully functional were different from damaged and non-functional, and Thragg was adapting his technique around the compromise with the efficiency of ancient experience. Mark's position shifted, his grip adjusted, he re-established. "You've been in the sun before," Thragg said. Mark registered the return of Thragg's voice. The laryngeal compression had resolved on schedule. 4 minutes and 11 seconds, consistent with every prior application. Thragg had been silent since the strike and had given no indication he was waiting for the return. The first thing he had used the voice for was a statement of fact. Once, Mark said, the first time I barely made it out. And this time I planned the exit. He adjusted their trajectory slightly, 2 degrees a correction for the sun's gravitational influence on their approach vector. Without the correction, they would have skimmed the outer corona. With it, they would enter it. You didn't plan anything. That's the difference. Thragg tried a different counter for the nerve compression. He drove his thumb into the radial nerve on the underside of Mark's gripping hand. A legitimate counter, a real one, the kind of technique that a being with Thragg's depth of knowledge would arrive at when the standard approaches failed. It produced a burst of sharp disruption in Mark's hand. The grip loosened by 15%. Thragg felt the 15% and exploded his arm outward. Mark's hand moved with the explosion rather than against it, turning the released tension into a spin. And in the spin, he got both hands on Thragg's right arm, the damaged shoulder, the compromised joint, and changed his direction to compensate for the lost grip. Now he had Thragg's damaged arm in both hands. The leverage geometry was different, but the fundamental situation was the same. Thragg being towed, unable to break free without a counter he hadn't developed yet. They crossed into the outer corona. The temperature did not increase gradually at the corona's boundary. It jumped. The plasma environment of the solar corona was not a continuation of the increasing warmth of the approach. It was a different category of thermal input entirely, millions of degrees in the ambient environment. The heat conducted through direct contact with plasma rather than through radiation alone. Both of them burned. Not combusted, their Viltrumite physiology would not combust under these conditions, their cellular density and durability extending their tolerances far beyond what the environment could achieve quickly. But the burning was real. The plasma touching exposed skin. Mark's face, his hands, registered as genuine thermal damage. The healing factor escalated immediately, diverting resources. Thragg made a sound. It was not words. It was the involuntary vocalization of a body receiving input at the upper threshold of its tolerance range. Mark held on. He held on, and he flew deeper into the corona. And the light was absolute, and the heat was total, and there was no direction that was not the sun. And he held on. You came here planning to execute me, Thragg said. His voice had changed quality in the corona. The plasma affected sound transmission even through suit systems, creating a distorted, pressured register. You came here knowing what this environment does. Yes. You've been planning this since before the battle started. Since before this timeline started, Mark said, I've had a long time to think about how to end you cleanly. This was always the cleanest option. He adjusted their depth slightly, not deeper yet, but repositioning for stability in the plasma currents that moved through the corona like enormous slow rivers. You planned to drag me here in the original version. You had the right idea. You just had the wrong person doing the dragging. Thragg tried to arrest their descent into the corona. He reversed his flight, putting everything into upward thrust. His power in this moment was enormous, undiminished by the damage to his shoulder in terms of flight generation, which was more dependent on the lower body than the right arm. Mark held the arm and matched the thrust, not exceeded it. He was not stronger than Thragg. He matched it. He held their depth constant, neutralizing Thragg's attempt to ascend without descending further himself. Two beings of extraordinary power, one trying to go up, one preventing it. The net result, a stationary position in the middle of the sun's corona. The heat was compounding. The healing factors of both of them were running at capacity. This was sustainable for a limited time. For Mark, a time he had calculated. For Thragg, a time he had not calculated and therefore could not manage. Here, Mark said, the word came out with an evenness that the environment had not touched. Almost peaceful. This is where it ends. Thragg attacked with everything. No combinations, no strategy. No assessment of what had worked and what hadn't. He let go of all of it. The tactical intelligence, the combat philosophy developed over millennia, the principle of managed force that had served him since before Mark's species had discovered agriculture, and he simply drove forward with the full commitment of his mass and velocity and power. It was the correct choice. Against the situation he was in, damaged shoulder, unknown exit timeline, thermal environment compounding by the second, committing to an overwhelming assault was tactically sound. It was what Thragg would have advised any of his commanders to do in an equivalent position. When your disadvantages are accumulating and your advantages are fixed, spend your advantages before they become irrelevant. Mark had known he would make this choice. He had made this choice himself, once, in a different version of this moment. He received the assault. He did not evade. There was nowhere meaningful to evade to. And more importantly, this phase required contact. He blocked what he could redirect, absorbed what he couldn't, and moved his body to distribute the force of each impact across the largest possible surface area rather than letting it concentrate. The damage he was taking was real. Thragg's fully committed strikes, even with the compromised shoulder, were arriving with the force of something that had no upper limit anyone had ever found. 3 strikes, 5, 7, on the 7th movement, Thragg's pattern in maximum commitment assault. Mark hit back. He had been counting since the first strike. Not consciously, not with effort. The count ran automatically, the product of having analyzed Thragg's assault pattern from inside it across 50 years of retrospective study. 7 strikes was the rhythm. The 8th movement was recovery. He had never had this knowledge in the original timeline, had never known to wait for the 8th. He hit the damaged shoulder at full extension, both feet planted on nothing, every available unit of his strength directed into the specific structural fault he had identified and struck before. The fracture that had been significant became catastrophic. The joint did not separate. Viltrumite anatomy resisted separation, the connective tissue too dense for a single impact to sever. But the structural load-bearing capacity of the right shoulder collapsed. The difference between the strike on the battlefield and this strike was the accumulation of damage between them. The battlefield strike had created the fault. The corona strike fell into it and widened it beyond the threshold of compensatory function. Thragg's right arm dropped. Not 3 inches this time. It dropped to his side and stayed there. His flight was unaffected. Flight generation ran from the lower body primarily. His right arm's combat function was gone. He made the sound again, the airless compression. And this time there was something beneath it, a quality that had not been there on the battlefield, that was there now, that Thragg would not have named, and Mark did not need to name because he recognized it. "Your right side is done," Mark said. He was not breathing hard. The healing factor was running full capacity, the thermal damage and the strike damage both being managed simultaneously, and he was spending resources at a rate he had budgeted for. "You still have your left. You still have your legs. You're still the strongest left-handed fighter I've ever seen." He moved to his own left, to Thragg's right, the dead side. "But you've never had to fight from your left exclusively. You've never had to develop it as your primary line. Your entire life, when something threatened you, your right arm solved it." He hit Thragg twice from the right side. Uncontested shots. The arm was there, available, but it could not answer. The impacts landed on Thragg's ribs and drove the breath from him in the corona's dense plasma. "You built your combat identity around your right arm," Mark continued. Not loudly. In the corona's thermal pressure, volume was irrelevant. Everything was vibration and conduction. Which means everything you know about defense was built around covering for a right-side offense. Take the offense away and the defense has a gap where it was always protected by the threat. He hit the gap, not the shoulder. That was done. The ribs on the right side, the liver area that Viltrumite anatomy protected with redundant organ placement, but did not make invulnerable. 3 strikes in sequence, left, right, left in a combination Mark had developed specifically for this geometry, specifically for this fight, over decades of preparation. Thragg's body answered for each one. His left arm came across to cover on the 3rd strike, the correct defensive response, and Mark was already on the left side before the arm committed. He kept talking, not to taunt. The function was psychological in the specific way that required precision. He was delivering the verdict. He was doing it here and now, and completely because this was the only time it would be delivered, and Thragg deserved to receive it in full. "You hid the population count for decades," Mark said. "Left jab. The Empire's numbers after the Scourge virus. You buried them because showing weakness would have cost you political authority. You chose your throne over your species' ability to plan for its own recovery." Right cross, redirected by Thragg's left guard, redirected again into a body shot. "The Thraxan program. You built this army for yourself, not for the Empire. The Empire needed a next generation. You gave it a private military." He moved through Thragg's guard on the left, found the angle. "These children, Every hybrid in this battle, they believe they're fighting for Viltrum. They're fighting for your control of Viltrum. Those are not the same thing. That distinction is the whole of your failure as a ruler. Thragg hit him, his left arm, fully committed, driving at Mark's jaw. It landed clean. Mark had been managing distance while he spoke, and the speech had cost him a half-second of positional attention. The strike connected, and it connected with everything Thragg's left side could generate, which was substantial. Mark's head went sideways. His position broke. He was 3 meters back before he arrested it. He shook out his jaw, came back. Thragg came with him, pressing the advantage of the clean hit, driving forward with his left in the same overwhelming commitment assault he'd opened with. The same pattern adapted for one arm. Mark counted again. 1, 2, 3. Different count. 6 on the left, not 7. He adjusted. On the 7th movement, the adjusted count, the left side assault pattern that had a different rhythm from the right side one, he hit back. He went for the left knee. The tendon strike, both hands, applied to the back of the kneecap at the specific angle that maximized tension on the patellar tendon. He felt the tendon stretch under the impact, felt the resistance and then the partial give that meant the load-bearing function had been compromised without severing. Thragg's flight, when he tested it in the next half-second, produced a wobble, an inability to maintain stable altitude. Then the right knee, same strike, same result. Now both. Thragg's flight became unreliable. Each attempt to ascend produced a drift, a list, a failure to maintain the intended trajectory. He was not grounded, not completely, not permanently, but the precise muscular coordination that stable flight required was disrupted in both legs simultaneously. He descended, not fell. He was still fighting the descent, still generating partial lift, still applying everything available, but the net result was downward, toward the solar surface, toward the unstable plasma that moved in slow, massive currents below them. He landed on the solar surface. His feet found what passed for a surface in a region of plasma and magnetic storm fields, the near-solid plasma foam of the corona's deep layer. He found his footing in it. He stood. He looked up at Mark. This was the moment Mark had been moving toward since before the battle. Not the physical position. Thragg on the solar surface, damaged, standing, not yet finished. But this look, this specific look. Thragg's eyes contained no surrender. They would never contain surrender. That was not a thing Thragg was capable of producing. What they contained was something older and harder to see in him than fear. The knowledge. The complete arrived-at knowledge that this was the last exchange. He was not processing tactical options. He was not running survival calculations. The expression on his face was the expression of a being who had been certain of their own supremacy for millennia, and is standing in the moment when the certainty resolves into its opposite, and is doing it without flinching. Invincible, he said. His voice carried even here. Mark descended to the plasma surface. He stood on it. He was burning. They both were, the corona environment extracting its continuous toll, and his face showed it in the reddening of the skin and the sustained effort of his healing factor. He looked damaged. He had planned to look damaged. He had planned to be damaged. He had spent 50 years deciding this was acceptable. He looked at Thragg. "You were the strongest Viltrumite who ever lived," Mark said. Past tense. Deliberate. Final. You could have been the greatest Grand Regent the Empire ever produced. Instead, you spent millennia making yourself indispensable, and making the Empire dependent on that indispensability. He held Thragg's eyes. You were not building an empire. You were building a monument to Thragg. The Empire was the medium. "You don't?" Thragg began. "I understand everything," Mark said. "Flat. Complete. I have had 500 years to understand it." He reached down. He put both hands on Thragg's head. He looked at him. One long, clear look, dispassionate and complete, and he let the moment exist for the time it took to exist. He gave Thragg the second he deserved. Not mercy. Not hesitation. A full accounting. Then he did what needed to be done. The solar surface received what remained. The plasma currents, moving in their enormous slow rivers, took it. Not immediately. The density of Viltrumite biology resisted even this. But the corona was patient. Mark had planned for this too. He had positioned their descent to place Thragg in a current he had mapped from the original timeline. He rose from the surface. He was burning on his face and hands and every exposed surface. The healing factor was managing it, managing it with the focused intensity of a system doing the most important work it had ever been asked to do. His vision was partially compromised in his left eye from plasma exposure. His right shoulder had absorbed enough sustained damage that the joint was unreliable for high-force applications. He was functional. He had planned to be functional. He reached into the plasma beside him and retrieved what he had planned to retrieve. The proof, the incontrovertible fact that would communicate to thousands of witnesses what had happened here and remove any ambiguity about the outcome. He held it in one hand. At his side, he began to fly toward the engagement zone. The corona's boundary was a threshold. On one side of it, the total environment, the plasma and the heat and the magnetic interference that had swallowed all other reference points for the last several minutes. On the other side, space. Black, cold, and immediate, the transition between them violent in its abruptness. Mark crossed it. He came out burning, not in the metaphorical sense, in the literal, physical sense of a body that had been in an environment of millions of degrees and was now in an environment of near absolute zero, the thermal differentials doing exactly what thermal differentials did to matter at those extremes. His exposed skin was damaged in the specific pattern of someone who had been in the corona long enough for it to matter, but not long enough for the damage to be permanent. His healing factor had been running full capacity since he entered the corona and would continue running full capacity for the next 20 minutes while it closed the work. His left eye had partial function, the right was clear. He flew. Not at maximum velocity, he was managing 3 simultaneous demands on his attention: healing, navigation, and the object in his right hand, which he was carrying with the care appropriate to what it represented. He flew at a pace that was steady and direct, and that would put him above the engagement zone in approximately 4 minutes. He opened comms at 2 minutes out. Alan answered before the connection fully established. The Coalition commander had been monitoring his suit's transponder signal, had been monitoring it since the moment it began moving away from the battle toward the sun, had watched it enter the corona, had watched the silence of the corona's electromagnetic interference consume the signal entirely, and had been watching the zone of interference for the return. He had been watching for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Mark, Alan's voice had something in it that Alan's voice did not typically carry. Report. It's done, Mark said. The connection held. Alan was processing. Mark had learned, across 50 years of working with Alan in the original timeline, that Alan's silences were productive. He was not pausing for effect or from uncertainty. He was completing a calculation before he spoke. Thragg, Alan said. Yes. Another silence. Shorter this time. You're coming back. 2 minutes. Broadcast on every frequency before I arrive. Coalition and Viltrumite both. I want every combatant to receive the signal simultaneously. Visual feed from my suit camera. He made an adjustment to his carrying hand, ensuring the suit camera's angle would capture what he was carrying clearly. Don't preface it. Don't announce it. Just open the channel and let the image do the work. Understood. Alan opened his channels. Not the Coalition military network only. He opened every frequency his communications systems could reach. The entire electromagnetic range that Coalition and Viltrumite technology shared, the universal broadcast band, that every suit, every ship, every communication system in the engagement zone would receive. The signal went out, and on every receiver, in every ship, in every suit, on every display, the same image. Mark flying. Coming from the direction of the sun, his face and hands showing the marks of where he had been, his left eye not quite right, his posture carrying the specific quality of someone who had done a necessary thing and was returning from it. And in his right hand, at his side, held simply and without drama, Thragg's skull. Clean. Complete, the bone structure that every Viltrumite in the engagement zone had seen attached to the most powerful being their civilization had produced. Incontrovertible. Not symbolic, actual. The physical proof that could not be argued with, that left no interpretive space, that communicated its single fact with the directness of things that were simply true. Mark did not hold it up. He did not display it. He carried it at his side the way you'd carry a stone you'd picked up for a specific purpose, and the camera angle captured it clearly, and the signal carried it to every receiver in the engagement zone without commentary. The fighting stopped. Not immediately on every front. The mechanics of a battle involving thousands of combatants did not allow for instantaneous cessation. But it stopped in the way that a fire stops when the oxygen is removed. Quickly, comprehensively, leaving behind only the residual of what had been burning a moment before. Engagements that had been mid-exchange simply did not continue. Fighters on both sides who had been committed to a strike did not follow through. The engagement zone went from the organized chaos of an active battle to something else, something that had no good military name. Not a ceasefire because ceasefires were arranged, not a surrender because surrender had not been offered. Something more fundamental, the spontaneous cessation that occurs when the premise of a conflict is removed in a way that every participant can see and cannot argue with. Mark arrived above the center of the engagement zone. He looked down. Thousands of combatants, hybrid Thraggs and Viltrumites, the children that Thragg had bred for this war, suspended in the space between continuing and stopping. Coalition soldiers from a dozen species watching the figure descending toward them with the same quality of attention. Focused, total, all of it directed upward. The hybrid forces were not routing. He had known they would not rout. Viltrumite stock did not rout. That was not a behavioral response available to them. They were recalibrating. The specific recalibration of soldiers who had been operating within a command structure that has just been removed, trying to determine what their situation was and what the correct response to it was. Mark descended to a position approximately 50 meters above the center mass of the hybrid formation and stopped. He held up Thragg's skull. One clear movement. Not theatrical, he raised his arm to shoulder height and held it there, the skull visible, the fact of it available to every visual receiver in range. He held it for 5 seconds, long enough for the fact to land in every processing system in the engagement zone. Then he lowered his arm. He looked at the hybrid forces. He looked at them the way he had looked at Ursal when he held her blade, not with contempt, not with triumph, with the clear, complete attention of someone who was about to say something that mattered and intended for it to be received. He opened the broadcast channel. He spoke in Viltrumite, the language of the Empire, the language these fighters had been raised in, the language of the only authority structure they had ever known. Thragg is dead. The Grand Regent is dead. His voice carried across the engagement zone without effort. Not because he raised it, he did not. Because the broadcast carried it, and because the silence that had descended over thousands of combatants gave it nothing to compete with. I am Mark Grayson. He paused. A full beat, not for drama, but because what came next required the space before it. This war is over. I am available for that position. The engagement zone held its stillness. In the hybrid formation below him, something was moving. Not bodies. The physical stillness held. Something else was moving, in the space between fighters, in the way attention shifted and redistributed. Mark watched it happen the way you watch a tide change, not a single visible moment, but a cumulative shift that resolved into a new state. He was looking for Ursal. He found her in the formation's center, surrounded by hybrids who had been watching her face since the broadcast began. She was looking at him. Her expression was what he had assessed it would be from his encounter with her 2 hours ago. The grief was there, the rage was in it, the fierce Viltrumite pride that would never be fully extinguished, all of it present. And beneath it, visible now in a way it had not been when she left him after the blade, the fracture. The thing he had said to her about her father's design for this army had gone somewhere in her and kept working, and the broadcast had done the rest, and the fracture was now too large to be covered by anything remaining. He watched her make her decision. She did not announce it. She did not build to it. She looked at him for one more second, and then she looked at the fighters around her, her siblings, her kin, the army that had been built for a dead man's war. And she said something. He could not hear it from 50 meters up, did not need to. He watched its effect move through the formation like a wave through water. She lowered her weapon. It was not a dramatic gesture. She was holding a secondary blade. Her primary was in pieces somewhere in the engagement zone, and she brought it down from guard position to her side and held it there. The movement was minimal. Its meaning was not. The hybrids around her followed. 1, and then 3, and then 12, and then the cascade. The specific cascade of soldiers watching their most ferocious sibling make a choice, and understanding that if Ursal had made it, then the calculation that produced it was sound. Weapons lowered throughout the formation, not surrendered, not dropped, not given up. That would come later and would be a different and more formal moment. Lowered. A posture of cessation rather than submission. The coalition forces held their positions. Mark had not countermanded the hold order, The hold order was still active, had been active since before he left for the sun. They were watching. Alan's voice came through the command channel. Private, just for Mark. The hybrid formation is standing down. I have coalition units on 3 vectors that are in position to advance if you want to lock this in. No, Mark said. Mark, leave the choice intact. He watched Ursal below him. The moment we advance on a standing down force, we change what this is. We need this to be their decision. A pause. Understood. Thousands of combatants in their positions, weapons lowered or held but not active, watching the figure 50 meters above them, who had just done something none of them had documentation for, in their understanding of the universe. Below him, the coalition soldiers were beginning to process what they had witnessed. He could read it in their postures. The specific quality of people who had been fighting a war they were losing 45 minutes ago, and are now standing in a stopped battle holding the fact of their survival. The tail-scryen analyst on Alan's command ship, watching through the tactical display, pulled up her battle probability assessment. 45 minutes ago, it had read 14% in coalition favor. She ran it again with current data. The field came back with a response it had never returned before in this engagement. The variable is resolved. Assessment inapplicable. She looked at the result for a moment. Then she looked at Alan. Alan was looking at the image feed, at Mark, hovering above the stopped battle, carrying what he was carrying, his face showing the marks of the corona, his left eye not quite right, his posture carrying the specific quality of someone who had arrived at exactly where they planned to be. Sir, she said, the battle analysis is showing a 93% probability of coalition tactical success in the next 15 minutes. 20 minutes ago, it was showing 14%. I know, Alan said. That's not. I know, Alan said again. He watched Mark's signal on the tactical overlay. Then he looked at the image feed one more time, at the figure above the stopped battle, and something resolved in his expression. Who is he? The analyst said. Not a security question, a genuine one. Alan thought about it for a long moment. He thought about the 47 seconds of combat footage he'd watched twice at quarter speed, about the nerve cluster technique, about the frequency, about the coordinates delivered with the certainty of complete foreknowledge, about a young man who moved like something 5 centuries old. He's the Emperor, Alan said. He said it simply, the way you say something that has stopped being a question and has become a fact. And he looked at the image feed, and below Mark, the stopped battle held its stillness. Mark descended through the hybrid formation. Not above it, through it. He came down to ground level, to the plasma-scarred surface of the engagement zone's debris field, and he walked. 50 meters, 100, threading between the standing fighters with the unhurried attention of someone who had done this before, and understood what it communicated. An emperor who hovered above his kneeling subjects was distant. An emperor who walked through them was present. The distinction mattered more than most tactical decisions. The hybrids watched him pass. They did not move. Some of them tracked him with their eyes, the specific tracking of fighters who were no longer combatants but had not yet determined what they were. He met several of the looks directly, without aggression and without reassurance. Just the clear, complete attention of someone who saw them and was not afraid of what he saw. He stopped at the formation's center. Ursal was there. She had not moved from the position where she'd lowered her weapon. She was standing with the stillness of someone who had made a decision that cost something, and was standing in the cost of it. He looked at her. Stand up, he said. She was already standing. He meant something else by it, and she understood him. The instruction to stop holding herself in the posture of someone waiting to find out what had been decided about them. She adjusted, marginally. It was enough. Your father built this army, Mark said, quietly. Not for the formation. For her. He told you it was for the Empire. Some part of him may have believed that. But the decisions in the breeding program, the combat training doctrine, the deployment planning, all of it optimized for one outcome. Not Viltrumite survival. Thragg's continued rule. Ursal's jaw was set. The grief was in her face, and she was not hiding it because she was Viltrumite, and grief was not a thing Viltrumites hid. They did not have that particular custom of concealment. She was holding the grief and the rage and the thing beneath both of them that had no name yet, and she was listening. I need someone who knows this army, Mark said. Who knows their loyalty structures and their training doctrine, and what they were told they were fighting for. I need someone who can help me give them a different answer than the one your father built into them. He held her eyes. That's you. Not as a reward, not as mercy, as a function. "You killed my father," she said. "Yes, and you expect me to serve you? I expect you to serve the Empire. That's a different thing. You already know the difference. You made your decision down here before I said a word. You made it because you understood that your father's cause was over and the Empire's cause was not." He paused. "I'm asking you to keep understanding that." She looked at him for a long time. The calculation in her eyes was not simple. It had grief in it and rage and the particular Viltrumite pride that would not produce a clean, uncomplicated yes. He did not need a clean yes. He needed the truth. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. That was the transaction. Both of them understood it as one. He turned and walked back through the formation, and this time the hybrids he passed were doing something different with their eyes. Not tracking a threat, tracking an authority. Alan's command ship had descended to close engagement range by the time Mark cleared the hybrid formation's edge. The ship was coalition military design, functional, scarred from the battle, one engine mount trailing debris from an early engagement hit. It landed in the debris field with the directness of Alan's general approach to everything. Alan emerged alone. He crossed the distance between the ship and Mark without his usual support staff. He stopped 3 meters out and looked at Mark with the complete attention he brought to everything, and then he looked at what Mark was carrying, and then he looked back at Mark's face. "You planned this before the battle started," Alan said. "Before this version of the battle started," Mark said. "Yes. The frequency, the commander coordinates, the ambush positions. All of it. How long have you known?" 500 years. Mark watched Alan process this. He had always appreciated Alan's processing speed, the way complex information arrived and found its category without visible struggle. "I lived through a different version of this. Longer, worse, more costly. I came back to this moment with everything I learned." Alan was quiet for a moment. Around them, the engagement zone was transforming, coalition forces beginning the careful process of establishing perimeter positions, hybrid fighters standing in their formations. The specific held breath of a battle that had ended without formal conclusion. The treaty, Alan said finally, he had moved past the mechanism and arrived at the implications, which was Alan's nature. "You're proposing to end hostilities between the Coalition and the Viltrumite Empire." "I'm proposing to restructure what the Viltrumite Empire is," Mark said, "which ends the hostilities as a consequence." He had the terms in full, developed over decades in the original timeline, and refined in 500 years of governance. He delivered them directly. The Empire ceases all expansion activities for 100 years. Complete moratorium. In exchange, the Coalition recognizes my rule and stands down all offensive operations. He paused. The hybrids are recognized as full Viltrumite citizens, not soldiers, not a secondary class. People with the full rights of imperial citizenship. The Empire gets its next generation. Integrated, not weaponized. Earth, Alan said. Protected protectorate. Sovereign governance with imperial protection. Not a vassal, not a conquest. A partner. He met Alan's eyes. "I have connections to Earth that are not political. I'm not pretending otherwise. But the terms are strategically sound, independent of that. Earth's relationship with the Coalition generates goodwill that translates to stability. Stable protectorates require fewer imperial resources. The math works." On looked at the engagement zone, at the stopped battle, at the thousands of fighters on both sides waiting for what came next. "The Coalition Council will want to negotiate," he said. "They can negotiate. I have a century of patience." Mark looked at him steadily. "But the core terms are the core terms. The moratorium, the recognition, the hybrid citizenship, the Earth Accord. Those are not movable." Alan studied him. Then he nodded, once with the particular quality of a decision being made rather than a statement being agreed to. "I'll convene the council," Alan said. "You'll have your treaty." Nolan found him at the edge of the debris field 40 minutes later. The formal proceedings had been initiated. Alan had opened the council channel, coalition units had established their positions, and the first stage of the hybrid forces' formal cessation was underway under Ursal's direction. The machinery of peace was in motion. It did not require Mark's constant presence to continue. Nolan came from the north. He was carrying his own damage from the battle, ribs, probably, and a deep bruise across his left side that his healing was working through. He landed and stood and looked at his son. Mark looked back. There was a version of this conversation that would have been about explanation, about what had happened, about the memories, about the 500 years of a life that hadn't happened yet and now would not happen in its original form. That conversation was available. It was not the conversation Nolan was here for. Nolan looked at him for a long time, at the marks on his face from the corona, at the quality of how he stood, not the quality of the boy Nolan had known before this battle, but something older, settled, continuous. "You did it right," Nolan said. His voice was straightforward. He meant it as a complete statement, not a preface to something else. Mark received it. "You were fighting in the North Quadrant," Mark said. "I had a unit covering your position. You were never in the direct engagement path. I noticed." Nolan looked at the debris field, at the stopped battle, at the shape of what had happened here. "You were managing the whole thing." "Yes, from the beginning. From before the beginning." Nolan processed that. He did not ask the how of it. He had understood from the moment he looked at his son in the engagement zone and said, "You're not 20 years old anymore," that the mechanism was beyond his current information. He filed it. He would ask later, in the right context, and Mark would tell him. "Okay," Nolan said. And then, after a moment, "Good." That was enough. It was, in its way, everything. The specific compression of a complicated relationship into 2 words that had earned their simplicity. Oliver came after Nolan left. He approached with the specific quality of someone who had been deciding how to approach for the last hour. He stopped 5 meters out and stood there with his hands at his sides and his face carrying the expression of someone who has been trying to fit new information into an existing frame and has accepted that the frame needs to be replaced. "You're not my brother," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of something he was working through. "I am," Mark said. "I'm more of him than you've seen before." He looked at Oliver. This was the face his brother had been wearing when everything started. Young, adaptable, more capable than he yet knew. "You're going to want to ask me a lot of questions." "Yes," Oliver said. "I have time. We have centuries." He said it the way he had always planned to say it, when this moment finally came. Not as a fact about duration, as a gift, the specific gift of patience, offered to someone whose life had been short and fast, and full of things happening before he was ready. Oliver's expression shifted. The thing he had not been able to fit into his existing frame didn't need to fit. It was its own thing, its own category. He accepted it. "Centuries," he said. "At minimum," Mark said. He found a moment alone. Not private. In the aftermath there was no private. Only degrees of witnessed. But the specific combatants had dispersed to their tasks, and he was standing at the edge of the debris field with the engagement zone behind him and the system's planets in the distance. The battle's residue still visible as drifting debris and cooling ship hulls. He looked at Earth on the tactical display. It was a blue dot at this distance, small and unremarkable in the star field, not distinguishable from the other planets in this system without the label the display provided. He had looked at it like this many times in the original timeline, from great distances, from the positions that Empire required. It had never stopped being what it was. He made one comm call. The connection routed through the coalition network, through the relay station at the system's edge, through the long chain signal path that connected deep space to Earth's communication grid, through the residential network that ended at a house in a suburb where a woman named Debbie Grayson was living her life and did not know what had happened today. The signal took 11 seconds to complete the connection. Mark, her voice, immediate, with the specific quality of mothers who answer calls from their children and are already listening for the answer in the question. "Is everything okay?" He looked at the blue dot on the tactical display. "Everything's fine, Mom," he said. "I'm coming home." He looked at the battle's aftermath, one final time, at the stopped war and the treaty that was being drafted, and the empire that needed what it was about to receive, at the 500 years of a future that had been rewritten from a moment of arrival in a battle that was already going wrong. He filed it. All of it. Then he turned toward Earth and flew. The war was over. The Empire was his. The timeline was closed. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.